John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome
glory,
to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of The History, Reminiscences of the 19th Massachusetts Regiment by Captain John G.B. Adams. Chapter 13. Macon continued. Charleston, under fire of our batteries on Morris Island. A stockade had been erected on the fairground, and 1,400 officers were confined there. This was the first stockade we had seen, and while our names were being taken and we were being searched, I had a chance to examine it. It was made of large trees driven in the ground, the inside covered with boards, and was about 15 feet high. A walk was built around it for the guard, and at each corner was placed a piece of artillery, which commanded the inside of the prison. The door swung open, and we were marched in. Had we entered the lower regions, we could not have been more horrified. Nearly all the officers had assembled at the gate, and such a looking set, half naked, unshaven and unshorn, some dragging themselves along by the aid of sticks, others lying down in the dirt. For the first time, my courage failed me, and my heart grew faint as I thought that I must pass through what they had already seen of prison life. They did not look like human beings, and appeared less so as every mouth opened, and the cry of fresh fish was heard on all sides. It is an old saying that misery loves company, and since I entered Macon stockade, I have never doubted it. They would crowd around us, and the gang would howl, "Give the mare, don't steal his blanket. Oh, don't put that louse on them," etc. We made our way through them as best we could, and as the place was crowded, lay down in the dirt, the first vacant spot we found. As soon as we were located, and the excitement attending our reception had subsided, we began to walk about. Our newness was apparent, and we would soon be joined by some honest-looking prisoners who would begin to inquire how we were captured, would ask all sorts of questions, and before we were aware of it, we would be drawing a line of battle in the dirt with a stick and explaining that we lay here, the regiment on our left broke, the rebels came in there, etc. A little group would gather around us, all interest in asking questions. After we had satisfied this party, they would move on, and soon another would come up, and we would go over the same ground. After we had gone through this performance 4 or 5 times, we began to catch on, and would show, when questioned, that we were not so very fresh. I thought our reception was a little unkind, and resolved that I would never be engaged in anything of the kind. But when the next batch of prisoners arrived, I was in the front rank and howled, "Fresh fish," as loudly as the best of them. The officers of our regiment became divided here. Major Dunn was in one part of the stockade, Captain Hume and Adjutant Curtis with some of the 71st and 72nd Pennsylvania in another. Lieutenant Chubbuck found a friend from Quincy, Massachusetts, and went with him. Lieutenant Osborne and I joined Captain McHugh of the 69th Pennsylvania. Inside the stockade were 2 old buildings, each filled with prisoners. Many had dug holes under them, and were sheltered in that way, but the last 200 or 300 had no shelter. Around the place was a low fence, 20 feet from the stockade, called the deadline. It meant that all that its name implies, for to touch or step over it brought a shot from the guard, which was the only warning. Our rations were cornmeal, issued uncooked, and as no extra cooking utensils were provided for the additional men, we often had to wait until midnight for a chance to cook our dinner. If we could borrow a kettle, we made mush. If a skillet, made bread. And if neither, made a cake by making a dough and throwing it in the hot ashes. This was called an ash cake. We drew very little salt, so I exchanged my $10 greenback, receiving 5 for 1 Confederate money, and paid $2 a pound for salt and 15 for soda. The price of everything was so high that my $50 soon vanished. The only time I heard music of any kind inside the rebel lines was at MACON. Outside the stockade where the guards were quartered were 2 Negroes who played the fife and drum. They could play but one tune, Bonnie Blue Flag. At reveille, guard mounting, dinner call, retreat, and tattoo, the fifer shrieked and the drummer pounded out this same old tune. I do not think that the Southerners are a musical people, for I never heard their soldiers sing around the campfires, and believe they left this, like everything else, to the Negroes. There was a chaplain confined with us who was a very earnest Christian. Every night he held services on the steps of the main buildings, and, with a voice that could be heard throughout the prison, would pray for our country and flag, and for damnation and disaster to all rebels. The commanding officer came in one day and ordered him to stop, but he said they put Paul in prison, yet he prayed, and while he had a voice, he should pray to his God, and use language best suited to the occasion. Courage always tells, and when they found that they could not frighten him, they let him pray unmolested. We had been at MACON about a week, when one of the officers came to me and asked me if I would like to escape. I answered yes. We talked a while on various subjects, and on leaving he said he would call for me that night. That midnight he came, and I went with him to one corner of the stockade, where we were joined by 3 more. We formed a circle, with our hands on each other's shoulders, and I took the most solemn obligation ever taken by man. I swore to obey in every particular the orders of my superior officers, to take life, if necessary, in order to escape, and to kill anyone who should betray us. Our organization was called the Council of 10, as it was governed by 10 officers selected by the captains of the companies. We were divided into companies of 32, each commanded by a captain, and subdivided into squads of 8, commanded by a sergeant. The privates only knew the sergeants, the sergeant knew his captain, and the captain the Council of 10. We had signs, passwords, grips and signals, and a grand rallying cry. We were ordered to provide ourselves with clubs if they could be obtained, or in place of them have a stone located where we could easily get it. It was strange to me why this organization was required, but I was informed that traitors were in the camp, that several tunnels had been started, and when ready to open, the rebels would come in, go directly to them, and driving down a crowbar would find them the first trial. It was hard to believe that any Union officer would betray his comrades, and we concluded that the rebels must have some of their men in with us. At any rate, our leaders thought that a secret organization was necessary for our protection. A good part of the time was taken by the rebels in finding out if any had escaped. Every day the commanding officer with the guard would come in and drive us to one side of the prison, then back in single file between 2 guards, counting us as we passed through. It was not often that the first count was right, and we would be driven back again. It usually took from 1 to 3 hours before they were satisfied that we were all there. The last of July, it was rumored that 600 were to leave the prison to be exchanged. The old fish took little stock in it. The order of the council was for all our members to go who could. The next day all was excitement. The rebel officer in charge came in, said that exchange had been agreed upon, and that all would soon go, but only 600 who would go that day. They began to check out the first 5 squads, and Captain McHugh, Lieutenant Osborne, who joined the council the night after I did, and myself flanked out when other names were called. We believed that the last shall be first. As all who went out were not members of our own order, we were directed to tie a string in our buttonholes so that we could be recognized. We were marched to the station and placed in boxcars. Our sergeant posted 2 men over each guard in the car, with orders to seize and tie them when the signal was given. This was to be a red light shown from the forward car. Our leaders had maps of the country, and had concluded to capture the train at Pocataligo Bridge, 7 miles from the seacoast, take the muskets from the guard, put the guard in the cars, set the train in motion, then make our way to the coast. Signal our gunboats and be saved. Thus far everything had worked well. The guards in our car had not a cartridge left in their boxes, as we had taken them all out and had been able to take some of the caps off their muskets. We were as determined a body of men as ever lived, and it would have been liberty or death with most of us. Some in our car had been over the road and knew where we were expected to begin work. We waited for the signal, but it was not shown, and we began to get uneasy as it was evident that we had passed the point. Some jumped from the cars, but we were so near Charleston they were recaptured and arrived in the city as soon as we did. Someone had blundered, or we were betrayed. We never found out who was responsible, but always thought we were betrayed by a regular army officer who was exchanged soon after we arrived in Charleston. I do not think he entered the jail with us. Disheartened, hungry, and tired, we arrived in Charleston. We did not know why we had been sent there, but in every heart was a hope that it might be an exchange. They marched us through the city down into the burned district. As we halted on one of the streets, a woman on the sidewalk said to me, "I don't think they will put you way down under the fire." This was the first intimation I had received of what they intended to do with us, but it soon became known that we were placed under the fire of our batteries on Morris Island. The noble qualities of the Southern chivalry were being shown to us every day. Yet this was the most cowardly act of all, to place unarmed men under the fire of their own guns. We continued the march to the jail, and were turned into the yard. I was more wealthy than when we left Macon. There were several naval officers in our squad, and the rebels had allowed them to retain their personal property. While at Macon, they had bought most of their food and saved their meal. On the march to Charleston, one was directly in front of me. He had a heavy load to carry, and not being used to marching had a hard time. Among his effects was a bag containing about a peck of meal. He would change it from one hand to another, and at last set it down, as he could carry it no further. I was in light marching order, and as soon as it touched the ground, I picked it up and carried it into our new prison. I also had a broken water pitcher that the guard had allowed me to take out of the gutter, so I had a meal and a dish to mix it in. We found the jail yard a filthy place. In the center was an old privy that had not been cleaned for a long time, and near it was a garbage pile where all the garbage of the jail was deposited. A gallows occupied a place in the rear of the yard. The wall surrounding the yard was 20 feet high, so that no air could reach us, and the hot sun came down on our unprotected heads. The only cooking utensils we had were those brought from Macon, and were not half enough to supply our wants. The jail was filled with all classes of criminals, male and female, and, with the exception of the women, all were allowed in the yard during some portion of the day. There were also several soldiers of the Maryland line, who had refused to do duty longer for the Confederacy, and several Negroes belonging to the 54th Massachusetts, captured at the siege of Fort Wagner. The Negroes were not held as prisoners of war, but rather as slaves. Their captors did not know exactly what to do with them. They were brave fellows, and at night we could hear them singing in their cells. I remember a part of one song. It was a parody on "When This Cruel War is Over," and ran as follows. Weeping, sad and lonely. Oh, how bad I feel. Down in Charleston, South Carolina, praying for a good square meal. We could hear our batteries on Morris Island, and often shells would pass over us. The second night we were there, 2 rockets were sent up near the jail, and after that the line of fire was changed. The rebels could not account for their rockets, and all concluded that they were discharged by our spies, or Union men in the city. Our home was under a window of the jail. Sometimes it would rain all night and we would have to sit crouched against the walls. Our rations were mostly rice, and we had not half a wood enough to cook it properly. Each day, a 4-foot stick of wood was issued to 25 men. We would cut it up into 25 little piles. One man would turn his back, and another would call the names of the mess, and at the same time pointing to a pile of wood. If by a chance he or one of his friends received a sliver more than another, some would declare that there was an understanding between the two. We were visited by the rebel generals Johnson and Thompson, who had returned from our lines, and after that our rations were less than before. One day, the rice was so poor and so full of bugs that we refused to accept it, and held an indignation meeting. We drew up a petition to General Jones, the rebel officer commanding the department, asking if the rebels could not or would not issue rations enough to keep us alive, that our government might be allowed to do so. The next day they sent in the same rice, and as the petition did not satisfy our hunger, we ate it, bugs and all, to keep from starving. Another day they issued nothing but lard. What they thought we could do with that I never learned, but I drew 2 spoonfuls on a chip and let it melt in the sun. We had no change of underclothing, no soap to wash with, and were covered with vermin. We hunted them 3 times each day but could not get the best of them. They are very prolific, and great-grandchildren would be born in the 24 hours after they struck us. We made the acquaintance of a new kind here, those that live in the head. We had no combs, and before we knew it, our heads had more inhabitants than a New York tenement house. After a hard scratch, we obtained an old pair of shears and cut each other's hair close to our heads. We were growing weaker day by day, were disposed to lie down most of the time, but knew that would not do, so resolved to walk as much as possible. We craved vegetables, and scurvy began to appear, sores breaking out on our limbs. One day a naval officer bought a watermelon. As he devoured it, I sat and watched him, the water running out of my mouth. When he had finished, he threw the rind on the garbage pile, and I was there. I ate it so snug that there was not much left for the next. Lieutenant Osborne and myself were the only officers of the 19th in the jail yard. The rest we left at Macon. One day a detachment came into the workhouse, the next building to ours, and I received a note, which was thrown over the wall, informing me that Captain Hume and Adjutant Curtis were with them. Exchange stock was unsteady. Several officers were exchanged by special order. Some of them, through the assistance of friends south, others by the influence of friends in Washington. Often the report would come in that a general exchange had been arranged, and the cry would grow through the yard, pack up, all exchanged." While it was an old story, and some of our comrades had heard it many times, the faintest hearts grew stronger, and visions of home would come, only to be swept away by the fact that the morrow found them starving in prison as before. The life in the jail yard began to tell on us. At MACON, groups would get together, sing old army songs, and merry laughter would be heard as some wit told his story. But now we heard no songs. The men walked about sullen and silent. It required little provocation to bring on a fight, as all were nervous and irritable. Our quarters grew worse each day, as nothing was done to change the sanitary condition of the yard, and 600 men, each doing his best, could not keep it clean unless assisted from the outside. About the middle of August, we were told by the rebel officer in charge that if we would give our parole not to escape, they would provide better quarters for us. At first the feeling was general that we would not do it, but after a while they began to go out, those who had talked the loudest being the first to go. Our little mess reasoned together. We feared that we should die here, as we suffered as much for want of shelter as food. We saw that the chances for escape were very poor, and as all the field officers had signed, concluded we would. This parole was an agreement that they should furnish us good quarters in the old United States Marine Hospital, and we should have the liberty of the house and yard, in consideration of which we were not to escape. We were the last squad to leave the yard, and as we went, took an old A tent that the rebels had brought in a few days before for some sick men. Although we had been in prison but 8 weeks, we had learned the ropes and took anything we could lift. We found on arriving at the Marine that we had made a mistake in not being first. Then we might have had a parlor. Now we must sleep on the upper balcony, but it was such a nice place, dry and clean, that we would have been contented to have slept on the roof. We arranged our captured tent to sleep on, and proposed to cut it up for clothing at some future time. We slept soundly that night, and were awakened the next morning by a rebel officer and 2 guards, who were searching for the tent. They took our names, saying we had violated our parole and must go back to jail. We did not spend a real happy day. Every hour we expected the guard would come in and march us out, but night found us unmolested, and we never heard from it again. From our balcony, we could look out over a part of the city, and our rear was only blackened ruins. Nearly every house had been riddled with shot and shell, and our own had not escaped. But in front of the houses looked clean, and each was surrounded with flowering trees and shrubs. It must have been a fine city before the ravages of war came. Our rations were about the same as in the jail yard, but were issued more regularly, and we had a better chance to cook. When we entered the Marine Hospital, I saw an old 2-gallon can and captured it. It had been used for spirits of turpentine. I unsoldered the top, cleaned it by boiling ashes, and made a bale out of an old piece of hoop. I now had quite an outfit. My kettle, pitcher, spoon, and a railroad spike to split my wood. I was a bloated capitalist. In a few days, a change could be seen in the appearance of the prisoners. Those who had been blue and careless of their personal appearance began to brace up. We organized by electing Captain Bilger of the Rhode Island Artillery as commander of the prison. He appointed a good staff and issued orders in regard to the cleanliness of the house and yard. A daily detail was made for fatigue duty, and any violation of the rules was promptly reported. Glee clubs began to be formed, and we had a fine quartet besides an orchestra of 4 pieces. Lieutenant Rockwell was the owner of a flute, and in some way 2 violins and a double bass were procured, which proved of great assistance to all, as it helped to keep us from thinking of our condition. Lieutenant Frank Osborne and I had passed a unanimous vote that we would live through our confinement, and in order to carry it out must take extra care of ourselves. In the yard was a pump, and every night we took a bath, one of us getting under the hose while the other worked the handle. The shelling of the city by our batteries was constant. At night we could see the flash as the old Swamp Angel on Morris Island was discharged. Then by the light of the fuse we could see the shells sailing through the air. When over the city, they would explode, and balls of fire would descend on the houses. At times 4 or 5 houses would be in flames at once. Then our batteries would pass in the shells at the rate of 20 an hour. We could hear the rebels rallying their fire department, which was composed of Negroes, and the engines would go rushing past the prison. These events were very pleasant to us, and the more frequent the shells came, the louder we would cheer. At times they would burst over us, and pieces would fall in the yard. The guards were nearly frightened to death, as they were new issue, and had never been under fire before. We would have felt a little easier if they had gone farther uptown, but acted as though we liked it. While at the Marine, I had a streak of good luck. We were American citizens, and believed in the right of petitions. One day those who had their money taken from them at Richmond drew up a petition and forwarded it to the rebel commander, setting forth the fact that the money had been taken and the promise that it should be returned, then praying him to interest himself in our behalf. We expected that we should never hear from it again. But in about a week, 15 received their money, and I was one of the number. The rest they said would soon come, but it never did. I exchanged $20, receiving 7.5 Confederate for 1. My first purchase was a fine-tooth comb, an article that could be used to advantage, which cost me $10. A quart of sweet potatoes for $2, and 10 small onions for 50 cents each. We tried hard to be prudent, and not forget that we had once been poor, but our wants were so many that in 3 days the $150 were all gone, and all we had to show was our comb and a darning needle. But our health was improved. We had eaten some of the potatoes raw, and those with the onions had helped our scurvy. Prisoners were constantly coming into Charleston from various places, and exchange stock was often high. One day a squad of officers who had been in Savannah were marched into the jail yard. From our quarters, on the upper balcony, we could see them, but were not allowed to talk. I recognized Lieutenant McGinnis, also Captain C.W. Hastings, of the 12th Massachusetts, Captain G.W. Creasy of the 35th, Lieutenants Cross, Moody, and Shute of the 59th, besides several others who had been comrades at Macon. They remained a few days, then were sent to other prisons. I wrote a note to McGinnis, tied it to a stone, and threw it over the wall. This was in violation of my parole, but I could not help that. One day, about 1,000 of our men came into the jail yard from Andersonville. It is impossible to describe their condition. They were nearly naked. Their skins were as dark as Indians and dried to their bones. Sergeant Daniel Corrigan of Company E was with them. It was a long time before I could recognize him. He had no shirt, and I could see that he was much emaciated. But he walked about, and I was sure that if anyone got a ration, Corrigan would, as he was the best forager in the regiment. I did not close my eyes to sleep that night, the coughing of the men in the yard preventing it. They remained but 1 day, then were taken to the fairground. Negroes passed the prison nearly every day, on the way to Fort Sumter. to restore the works which were being knocked to pieces by our batteries and gunboats. They were collected from the plantations in the country, and were a frightened-looking set. They knew that their chances for life were small, and they sang mournful songs as they marched along. The greatest trouble I had was cooking. I had no special qualifications for that work, and could not boil dish water without burning it on. But according to our rule, I must cook for our mess once in 3 days. My feet were bare, and the rice or mush would boil over on them, and I jumped back. I was sure to land in some other fellow's fire. Frank was one of the best friends a man ever had, and would often take my place, but McHugh was bound that I should learn the business. October 1st, the yellow fever broke out. Our guards were the first taken down, the captain and some of his men dying. Then it struck the officers in the prison, and it was not thought safe to remain longer in Charleston, so October 5th we were ordered to pack up and informed we were to be removed to Columbia. Our squad did not go until the 6th, but they started us so early that we had no time to cook our rice. As we left the prison, I bought an apple dumpling of an old black woman, and am ashamed to say that in my haste I forgot to return the spoon she loaned me to eat it with. If she will send me her address, I will send her a dozen as good as the one she lost. We were sorry to leave Charleston. While it was called the hotbed of secession, we had received the best treatment there of any place in the South. Our guards were kind, and we were seldom taunted by the citizens. We marched through the city, taking our baggage, and, as no two were dressed alike, were a queer-looking procession. There were many Germans in the city, and as we had several officers in our party from that land, they were anxious to do them favors. One had a bottle of whiskey, and gave it to one of his countrymen when the guard was not looking. Our comrade had on a rebel jacket, and as he indulged quite freely in the whiskey soon got returns and was fairly full. But the guard, thinking that he was a citizen, said, "You, get out of the ranks," and he got. Assisted by his friends, he was soon passed through the lines, and we afterwards heard from him with Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. Arriving at the depot, we were placed in boxcars, and, as usual on the southern railroads, the train ran off the track in a half-hour after we started, which delayed us several hours. The night was dark and rainy, and several escaped, among them Lieutenant Parker of the 1st Vermont Heavy Artillery. He was pursued by bloodhounds, and when we arrived at Columbia, was brought in so terribly torn and bitten by them that he died before night. Chapter 14. Columbia Presidential Election. And we'll do that next week. I know this book is about a war, and that at times it's very graphic. But of all of the chapters that he has written so far, this, I feel, is the most intense by far. It feels like it really accelerates in its visceralness. So I'm going to start from the very beginning, and let's take a look at these notes. All right. So the description of the prison is incredibly helpful in being able to visualize what he's talking about, especially when he arrives at this prison. If you guys have seen the movie Andersonville, which is about another prison but very similar in description, I highly recommend go see the movie. It'll give you a visual representation of what he experienced and the conditions that they were in. And of course, Andersonville sounds like it was worse, but maybe not by a whole lot. I don't know. Because by the time he sees Andersonville prisoners, he's, on the mend and doing a little bit better with his conditions. So I can totally understand why his heart would fail him as soon as he saw those prisoners in their prison. So describing them as no longer human, it's just I can't imagine what that's like, and to think about when you've already gone through so much, right? He does not put himself on a pedestal. And, kudos to him. He makes a note that's saying, like, when Fresh Fish came in, I was right there alongside yelling at him, which is hard. That's hard. And I'm sure there's a lot of things that Union soldiers did that they had to live with for the rest of their lives. So now, one of the aspects that I thought was really interesting was that some of the men got to live in the shelter, and then some had to dig holes and live underground, and then some just had to sleep on the ground because there's no room for anything, which is just awful. Now, I want to make a note about what he ate in prison, because he writes about it in this first stage. They had cornmeal, and he said that if he could borrow a kettle, he would make mush, or bread, or an ash cake, if all he had was just like the fireplace. Now, I think I might do some ash cakes. I've got a very nice fireplace, and maybe if it dries out a little bit, I'll film a video and do ash cakes. But I've read a lot about it, and I've seen some other folks do it, so we'll see. Now, I just want to talk about that preacher having a sermon every single day and calling for union and victory while trashing the rebels, which is just absolutely hilarious. Being like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? Just great. Now, one of the things that took me aside here, and I did spend some time looking, and I had to do a double take when I was reading this and stop and just look it up immediately. Their active escape plan that they had with their secret organization called the Council of 10. Like, how cool is that name? Like, are you serious? So I kind of went and looked. I was like, there's got to be some relation to who comes up with the name, the Council of 10. So there was on the historical record, there was a Council of 10. Now, from the years 1310 until 1797, one of the governing bodies of Venice, the Republic of Venice, took place annually, and they had something called the Council of 10, which had, immense power at that time. And basically they basically had to rule the city, with like these rich kind of oligarchs that were doing this. So if you want to look it up, there's a lot of interesting stuff to go with that. But the fact that we're only, they were dissolved only 65 years beforehand, or 66 years, whatever it is at this point. So obviously somebody had heard about them or knew about them. And when they were in prison, they were like, let's call ourselves the Council of 10. Super cool. Has a long history. So if you get the chance, just Google it. The Council of 10. I am going to spend probably the rest of my life trying to figure out who else was part of the secret organization. Who maybe, if we can find someone that was a part of the Council of 10, if you have heard or read or seen anything in relation to this, please reach out to me at my email, warofrebellion@gmail.com. Let me know what you think, what you found. Every time I talk to a historian, I'm gonna be like, hey, by the way, I've got this thing that I found, because this is just way too cool. I wrote down their organization here. So you had your 10 officers. They were organized into companies of 32 men, commanded by a captain, and they had then their sergeants and then their privates and so on and so forth. But they had signs and passwords, grips and signals, and a grand rallying cry And I want to know what that grand rallying cry is. Like, what was it? This is a crucial detail he left out, but apparently he took this oath very seriously and he didn't talk about it too much. So I would like to know about the Council of Ten, please, and maybe a little bit more of their shenanigans and maybe this train event that happened. So also the counting technique that they used by having soldiers placed on, or Confederate soldiers placed on either side and counting people as they come through. As the Confederate soldiers were placed on either side and they counted the prisoners as they walked through. You know, that's something that we do in the modern military as well, but not for prisoners. When we would do amphibious operations on Zodiacs in the Marines, when you're getting off the beach and on the beach to get on your Zodiacs, you go through that exact. You have two Marines, one on either side, and one is counting. And everyone has to pass through it. And that's how you know you have everybody when you're leaving and when you're coming back. So it's the first thing that I thought of when I read that. Ours went much quicker than taking, half a day. But it was just something that I thought of when it happened, or when I read it. But man, the Council of Ten. Oh, secret handshakes, grips, and all sorts. I'm just jealous. It must have been intense. I'm not jealous to have been in jail, though. So I have to tell you, when I was reading about their plan to escape, even though I knew it didn't happen, I wanted it to happen so bad. And that they suspected someone who betrayed them when they were going to launch the attack. Oh, it's just brutal. As I was reading it, I knew there was no train jailbreak that had happened, but I wanted it to be. So, moving on. Does anyone else know when we encountered the city of Charleston so far? In our last book with Susie King Taylor, in her memoir, she was at Fort Wagner watching them shell Charleston. And Morris Island is mentioned in her book, and guess what, everyone? It's a small world, because I think we have two memoirs that converge pretty close together. I know Susie King Taylor eventually makes it into Charleston, but that's after, the fighting has happened and the rebels have fled and that kind of thing. So I don't think our hero so far in this story will be there, but it's, they were close. We've read 3 books so far, and 2 of them were within just a few miles of each other, it sounds like. So I just love that in history. Also, when he gets to the jail in Charleston, the Union soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts are there. Some of those soldiers might have known Susie King Taylor because she used to hang out with them. It was just, man, it was great to see that, to see these kind of 2 stories collide adjacently. Now, I also want to say, it was only mentioned very briefly, but I want to talk about that secret mission in Charleston. At night in enemy territory, next to a jail holding your prisoners, the Union, either through spies or trusted Union men, let the cannoneers know where that jail was, via those rockets, it would seem. Shoot them up in the air and let them know where the Union prisoners were kept. But there were quite a few other areas in Charleston where people were also kept, so... But let's hope that it was. And if it was, oh man, they should turn that into a movie, because that would be great. And at this prison, they had no soap, had to eat rice that was unfit. I think he said it was filled full of bugs. Then they hunted rats 3 times a day to supplement their hunger. My goodness, how frightening. And probably pretty quickly losing kind of your established humanity, your dignity, where you're kind of like, when you're near starvation, you're just like, I will do whatever it takes to try and survive. It's very clear that this war was different in so many different ways for different folks. You can fight in the war, and then you get captured, and now you're trying to survive. Like, the whole battlefield side of things just fall away, and now it's just about survival. And we know a lot of Union prisoners that don't make it out. So, when you think about your role in this war, you have your regiment, your brigade, your division, your corps, all that. And you have people to talk to, but here in jail, the war becomes so small. Think about, visualize, everyone. You are in jail that cannot feed you, or can barely feed you, very little. You're stuck with just all these other people milling around trying to figure out, how do you keep going? How do you convince yourself that you need to stay alive? So, and then this is an insane ordeal that he's writing about, and I just want to make a note about how special it is that we have someone who has such a well-written record for us to comb over and talk about. So then they move these prisoners to the Marine Hospital, and I would like to make a note, that building is still around. So if you're in South Carolina, go check it out. If you're in Charleston, go check it out. It's still there. It's the same building. The way he describes it is still there. You can see exactly where he was probably living. And if you get a chance, maybe get inside. I pulled it up to look at it. It's a fascinating structure of Gothic design. A much better place for them as prisoners than a jail, that's for sure. And what he does talk about being there is really important. He gets a handful of pieces of garbage that are useful to him, but it's all he's got, right? And it made him feel like a filthy capitalist, he says. And he had a kettle, a pitcher, a spoon, and a railroad spike to split his wood with. So I looked around, I found some interesting articles on this place and came across a very, very fascinating article written by essentially the queen of Confederate stamp collecting, Patricia Kaufman. And she wrote a 3-part series. I could only find parts 2 and 3. I looked. I couldn't find part 1, but it's titled Prisoners as a Shield and Other Horrors of War as Experienced by James A. Penfield. She kind of puts it all together. Super interesting. I'm going to have it posted to the website. So come check it out. And everything that we've talked about here, I'm going to have it all together on the website in kind of different articles so you can go take a look at it. So now, when he describes the men coming in from Andersonville, I believe that is because General Sherman and his army are getting really close in Georgia, and the Confederacy starts shipping them out. And one of the places that they send them to is Charleston, because they didn't want to have... I mean, I could see why they didn't want those men to be found, because I'm pretty sure if the entire army found Andersonville, there would be 0 survivors, Confederate survivors. Because it's not just it's a prison. And when he talks about the soldiers come in, he talks about he doesn't get any sleep because of the cough. All of the men were coughing because they were sick. I have heard that before, and it's called the army cough. I guess this is the prisoner cough. But someone mentioned that once Reveille is sounded and the whole army wakes up, 100,000 men, and the coughing starts. So I can imagine what it would be like for thousands of prisoners from Andersonville who were all sick, just coughing all the time. They probably don't get to sleep very well either. So he mentions that some slaves were being collected from the countryside to go do repair work in Fort Sumter, which is right in line with this area. The U.S. Navy has Charleston blockaded, and they're just pounding Fort Sumter day and night in the city. So really just, if you take out Fort Sumter, you can get real close. So, and also I want to take a moment about this amazing jailbreak that a Union officer had in Charleston by getting passed alcohol from a German, because he was German, and he's wearing a Confederate jacket, and then being told to leave. Like, what are you doing? Get out of the ranks. Go somewhere else. And then he ends up getting smuggled back into Union territory. Oh my goodness. What kind of story, amazing story is that? Where's that gentleman's memoir? I want to know. I mean, can you visualize that? Like, you're in prison and people are just like, you need to leave. You're like, okay. I also wanted to say the jail that he is kept in Charleston. is they do haunted tours. Happens to be Halloween. Guys, if you want a haunted tour and you're in South Carolina, you can go to the jail that he was in, walk around the yard where they kept all the prisoners, and take a look. So I will post that website, that touring website, on my website if you want to go take a look. Maybe you happen to be in the area, you want to go check it out and have a cool tour. Well, there you go. So with that, my friends, I'm definitely 100% apologize for the very late episodes. So I will see you guys later this week. We'll have sorry to leave you on a cliffhanger for so long, but here's your episode. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for listening. I will catch you in the next episode. Come check out the website. We're going to have some things posted there along, I think, with some music. So have a great one. Bye-bye.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave, and Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. And now, though the grass grows green above his grave, his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so few, and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was John the Baptist, of the Christ we are to see. Christ who of the bondman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny South the slaves shall all be free, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. The conflict that he heralded, he looked from heaven to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall sing with anthems o'er the deed they mean to do, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. arms of freedom, then strike while strike ye may, the death blow of oppression in a better time and way. The dawn of old John Brown has brightened into day, and his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. For his soul